Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 215. Today, the Amateur Traveler takes a little break from destinations to talk about photography.
Got to see one more cathedral. Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into today's interview, I do have one very strange news story to share with you. In a story from CNN, a man who wrote not a threatening note, but certainly an odd one, and gave it to a flight attendant, had charges filed against him. The note that he filed, and I'm going to read what it said. "I thought I was going to die. We were so high up," the card said. "I thought to myself, I hope we don't crash and burn, or worse yet, landing in the ocean, living through it, only to be eaten by sharks, or worse yet, end up on some place like Gilligan's Island, stranded, or worse yet, be eaten by a tribe of headhunters. Speaking of headhunters, why do they just eat outsiders and not the family members? Strange. And what if the plane ripped apart in mid-flight and we plummeted to Earth, landed on Gilligan's Island, and then lived through it, and the only woman there was Mrs. Thurston Howell III. No Marianne, my favorite, nor no Ginger, just lovely. If it were just her, I think I'd opt for the sharks, maybe the headhunters." And that was just a little too odd for the flight crew who turned the plane around. You can find a link in the show notes to that story, as well as to the latest episode of This Week in Travel, where we talk about that and other travel news. This is a spot in the show where increasingly I'm hoping you're going to hear an advertisement, because having left my day job today, I'm going to need to do that to continue to both do this show and pay for my kids' college education and the mortgage and that sort of thing. And I'm going to use this spot today to remind you that the Amateur Traveler Vietnam Tour is coming quickly. 1 week after this show comes out is the deadline to sign up for that tour. So if you want to go on that tour, I need to know, and I need to know fairly quickly. And that tour is being sponsored by iExplore. And if you're interested in checking out their custom tours or their regular tours, and in supporting the Amateur Traveler, you can do that by going to amateurtraveler.com/iExplore. That's amateurtraveler.com/iExplore. And also, if you're a podcaster or videographer doing things on the internet, creating new media, either audio or video, you might be interested in another thing that's going on in June. And again, the deadline for this is about 3 weeks away, and that is a new media cruise in June from New York up to Halifax, a 5-day cruise where you can meet with other people who are doing similar things and learn more about the craft. And check out that announcement at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Ralph Velasco. Ralph is the founder of photowalkingtours.com. Ralph, welcome to the show.
Hey, Chris. Great to be here.
And Ralph and I are actually going to talk about a subject that we've dealt with twice before on the show, but it's one of my favorite subjects, and that's travel photography. And Ralph, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background as a photographer before we jump into some of the tips that you have?
Well, I've been photographing my international travels for over 30 years now. And currently I teach at 10 or 12 different institutions here in Southern California, from the University of California Irvine Extension Program to the City of Newport Beach and Calumet Photo. And so I have several different classes that I offer. I also have a series of photo walking tours, which is photowalkingtours.com. And I take people out on anywhere from 2 to 4 hour walking tours from San Diego up to Santa Barbara, and from Catalina Island out to Joshua Tree and even Death Valley and Chicago. And I'm expanding internationally now.
Excellent. And I should tell people that for those of you who don't normally watch the iTunes enhanced version, Ralph has given me a set of sample photos as we talk about some of these subjects. We're going to be referring to some photos, so if you're not looking at photos right now, you may want to pause, and we'll put a link in the show notes. I don't know if they'll be on Ralph's site or my site. We'll figure that out, but if you go to the show notes or watch the enhanced version, you'll have a picture of the photos that we'll be talking about. And this is going to be a good one to be looking at because this is going to be us talking about a visual medium. So, Ralph, if we have a camera and we are taking trips, how can we improve our travel photography? This is something I'm always working on. What kind of hints can you give me to try out to think about when I'm on my next trip?
You know, Chris, so one of my top tips is to avoid the crowds. And by that, I mean getting up early and staying out late. That's when the local people are going to be on their way to work. The children are going to be on their way to school. And those are the people that I want to take pictures of, that I want in my photographs, not the tourist crowds. They'll be out there soon enough. Patrick Symes has a great quote. He says, "If you don't like getting up early, then be a writer." So for photographers, you have to be willing to get up early, get out there before the crowds.
One of the favorite pictures that I have that I took of a trip that we had to Venice was actually St. Mark's Square empty. Not even pigeons there because I got up just a little before dawn. I just had trouble sleeping because I was so excited to be in Venice. And I think I have one lone person walking across St. Mark's Square. And you're right, it does. I enjoyed the pictures that I took of the tourists and the pigeons and all of that too, but I did get to see something different from getting up early. So I appreciate what you're saying there.
Absolutely. That's when you're going to get unique photos. Mm-hmm. And most people are out there, let's say 10 to 2 o'clock, which number one is the worst time of day for the light.
Right.
But number two, that's when the tour buses are in high gear. So I want to be out there early and after that to get the unique shots.
And we've covered it before, but when you say the worst light, the best light being what to you?
Well, certainly the golden hour.
Okay.
That's before, during, and just after sunrise and sunset both. When the sun is low in the sky, mm-hmm. It's giving you that, what I like to call that Rembrandt light. Mm-hmm. So it's real soft and it's complementary as opposed to really harsh and something that would take away from your subjects.
Okay. What's our next tip?
Chris, I like to provide a sense of scale in my images. And by that, I mean to have someone, a person or a bus or a tree, something that all your viewers can relate to and put in context next to the other image, that to the more maybe abstract structure or image that you have in your photograph.
And I loved the sample picture you sent of that, because it was the Bean in Chicago, or Cloud Gate, I believe is the official name of that. And you're right, I would have absolutely no idea. It's such an unusual shape that I have no idea whether we're looking at something that's 3 feet tall or 30 feet tall until you had the picture of somebody who's standing under it shooting up at it. So I really appreciated what you were saying from that sample picture.
Yeah, that's a really good example of just this sort of big abstract structure that most people that see it for the first time have no idea what it is. But then when you try to explain it, they still don't understand. But then when I showed the second picture,
right.
It's a 160-ton sculpture. And then when I show the picture with the photographer shooting up into it, you realize exactly what I'm speaking of and how large it is.
Well, and I think of a picture that I could have taken on my last trip that I probably missed that opportunity because I was shooting, and this was in the Geneva show, a sculpture which is a large chair, and it's 50 feet tall. But of course, when you look at it, if I don't have somebody standing there, it looks like a chair.
Sure.
So really, if I don't have somebody providing the scale there, and I'm not sure that I did in my shot, I probably missed the shot that I really wanted.
Yeah, your viewer would probably have no idea how large that chair really was until you put something in there, even if it was a tree or a lamppost or a car, anything to compare it to.
Excellent. What else are we going to do?
I like to add a human touch. Now, that kind of goes along the lines of providing a sense of scale. However, in the sample photos that I'm showing here, I've got one that I just took in Prague a couple weeks ago of a woman in this beautiful yellow hat, which another side point is having a little pop of color is always great. So this woman's got this wonderful yellow hat. She's standing next to a lamppost that would provide us the sense of scale. But to have that human person there, it makes the viewer be able to relate to it much more.
Yeah, no, I appreciated that shot. And of course, it also has some depth of field, which I know we're going to talk about a little later in that shot as well.
That's right. That's right. It really puts the person in context with the background. So adding a human touch, I love landscape photography, but I love it more when there's a barn or a car or a person or what I call a human touch. As opposed to just a blank landscape, no matter how beautiful it is. I want to see a kayak in that river or a ship on that ocean, something that helps me to relate to the scene.
And I find that I often still take pictures that I'm waiting for everybody to get out of the shot, and I'm not getting that person in there. And I think partially because it's just, I'm shy. I don't necessarily want to take a picture of that perfect stranger, but it does make it interesting. Especially, I loved your picture here. Both of your pictures you sent, and the other one you sent almost a black and white picture on a wintry day, and I'm guessing this is also Prague.
It's Salzburg, actually.
It's Salzburg, okay. The lone figure, very anonymous, both of these pictures. So it's not like you're doing a portrait, and yet it does give my eye a hint of what it is you want me to look at.
Yeah, definitely. I have students that will say, geez, couldn't you wait for that man to walk out of the way with that umbrella? And I said, no, I wait there until that man comes into my scene or someone does to provide me not only a sense of scale, but again, that human touch. That bridge just empty with, no matter how beautiful the scene is behind it, it doesn't say anything to me as to when I wait for someone to come into the scene like that. I call that waiting like a spider for a fly to come into the web. If I see a beautiful scene like this, I'll wait around until someone comes into that scene to give me that human touch.
Well, and the interesting thing I find with that shot is that you've got a church in the background and a bridge in the foreground, just a simple pedestrian bridge, and without the person on it, the bridge in the foreground, it doesn't belong there. Why didn't you just get closer and get rid of that bridge? And yet with the person on there, suddenly it's the focal point of the image. So it really does change the image that you've got.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Chris. Exactly.
Okay. What else should we think of?
I talk about embracing the weather. There's an old saying that in photography, there's no such thing as bad weather, just varying degrees of good weather. So I like to be out there when it's snowing, raining, sleeting, lightning. I mean, that's when all the other photographers are going to be at home nice and cozy in their beds, and you're out getting the unique shots.
Now, I think the phrase in England is there's no such thing as bad weather, there's just inappropriate clothing.
Another good point.
Well, and you say this, you and I apparently just missed each other in Prague by one day, and so we were talking about weather where you're walking out, shooting and taking people on photo hikes that was in the teens, so it wasn't like you were getting beautiful blue skies all the time.
No, but I hate when it's nothing but blue sky. I love to have clouds, because if you get back to the rule of thirds, a third of the scene should probably be clouds, or should be the sky. But if there's no clouds, then you want to de-emphasize that right away and get down to where the interest is. But I love clouds, really socked in, solid clouds, not so hot, but then that comes back to shooting at noon, and those kind of clouds can act as a nice diffuser for you. But having beautiful clouds, which we did when we were in Prague, really gave a lot of interest to that sky.
Well, and I found actually I had to shoot some headshots recently because we needed them for one of the other podcasts I was doing, and we just happened to have a beautiful, very cloudy day, and the light was very diffuse, and so it actually worked very well for portraits. Now, you mentioned rule of thirds, though, and we're jumping a little ahead because we haven't talked about what that is. And I know that a lot of people probably are familiar with that, but could you just explain what you mean by the rule of thirds?
Sure. The rule of thirds has you take a tic-tac-toe board and put it across the scene that you're looking at. Now, a lot of cameras nowadays come with that feature built in, so you could actually have that across your screen or in your viewfinder as you're looking through it. So you've got two horizontal lines and you've got two vertical lines, and there's two horizontal horizons, and there's something called a vertical horizon as well. So the idea is to put your subject on one of those 4 points where two of those lines meet, which will not be in the center. So off sort of to the bottom right, upper left, or bottom left. So you're setting the subject off to one side, and it could be also a scene where you're shooting a landscape of the sunset, and you've got a third sand, a third water, and a third sky.
Okay.
Now that's, just like all rules, very much made to be broken, and I will try it a lot of different ways, but that's sort of the rule of thumb.
Well, and one of the things I love, I think you're shooting digital these days, I believe.
Yes.
And the thing I love, you say try it a couple different ways, I don't have to necessarily, even like it used to be, go home and see that I missed that shot, but shoot it 6 different ways, and then either on the camera or later on decide which one I like better. That's one of the things I love about digital photography is it's making me a better photographer because the film doesn't cost anything.
That's exactly right. That's one of the beautiful things. You've got that instant gratification, and you're on site to make the adjustment right there. You don't have to come back. I mean, I'm not going to be in Prague again for a while, so if I looked at the back of my camera and saw that something was not correct with that exposure or the image itself, the framing, the composition, I can immediately correct it right then and there.
Okay. And you were talking about embracing weather before I took us off to the rule of thirds, so although, to be fair, you brought it up first. But you sent me 2 different pictures. One is obviously on a rainy day because we've got a rainbow, and this is a local Southern California picture, I believe.
That's right. I used to live on Balboa Island in Newport Beach, and every morning I would look out my window and just see what the clouds are like, because as I said, I like clouds. So one morning I looked out, and sure enough, there were these big puffy clouds, looked like it might rain a little bit. So I said, I'm going to go out and see what's out there. So I walked to the end of my street, and sure enough, there's a double rainbow that was across the harbor from me. Now, I just walked down a couple houses until it looked like it was going directly into the pavilion, which is that building right there in the center.
Okay.
I had about a 5-minute window before it really started raining, and I was the only person out there shooting, and there was a couple people walking by, and they said, "Boy, you're the only photographer out here today." And I said, "Yeah, and I'm the only one getting these shots."
Excellent. So the other thing then, the other trick you're using there is you're zooming with your feet in some sense. You're moving yourself to the left or right or forward until you line up the elements in your shot the way you wanted them.
Exactly. And that's what I call manipulating the scene. So I'm moving around until the scene does what I want it to do.
Sure.
And that's exactly what happened with this one.
Excellent.
And then with the other shot of Parliament in Budapest, I just wanted to show that, you've got these wonderful snow-covered roofs in the foreground, Parliament in the background, Danube River right in between. So not a lot of photographers out there in 10-degree weather, but they're missing a lot of shots like these.
Well, you do have to worry about steadying the camera while you're shivering there is my problem. But now, when you're out in the real weather, you talked about going out in sleet. Do you take any additional precautions in terms of protecting the equipment from the elements?
You definitely have to be aware that water is not your friend when it comes to electronics.
Right.
I'm definitely keeping an eye out that, number one, the rain's not coming onto the lens. Even if I have a filter on there, it's not going to be ideal for the shot. So I'm being very cautious, but I've always got some lens cleaner with me, a towel. One of my secrets that I've heard from other photographers is just get one of those little plastic shower caps that you get from the hotels.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And put that around your gear just to keep it, and it's clear. You could still work all your functions. So you definitely have to be cautious. You can't just be out there in a pouring rain.
Right. Well, and that's obviously one of the disadvantages of the digital cameras. They're a little more sensitive to the elements than the old film cameras were.
That's true.
Okay. What should we do next?
I like to say, give yourself an assignment to shoot what interests you. If it's interesting to you, it probably will be to your audience. And it doesn't have to be the sweeping landscapes, the interesting people. I have got this one image of a brandy snifter in Kotor, Montenegro, and it was just the way that they presented it to me. On a warm glass of water, they tilted the brandy glass on top of it, so it just got a little bit of heat from the warm water. And it's certainly not a shot that's going to win any awards or end up in any magazine, but we'll talk about it in a minute, though. It tells a story. And it's something unique to that place. I've never seen it before, so I'm going to take a picture of it. And I think that my viewers will be interested in something like that.
Interesting. I know there's a site that I belong to, and I can't even think of the name offhand, but I'll put a link in the show notes, that challenges you every day with take a picture of, and then gives you an assignment. The assignment is fairly new to me in terms of trying to use that as a tool to get me to think outside my little mental box. For me, for instance, I have the things that I collect also. I collect, for instance, pictures of doors when I'm in Europe for some particular reason, and of buildings that are in bad repair. There's something very photogenic about that for me. What assignments have you given yourself that really worked out, and what other ones have not worked out so well?
Well, it's funny you should mention doors, because I always say, if it's doors, windows, arches, things like that, you become hyper aware when you give yourself an assignment. When you buy a new car, let's say it's a...
Everybody's driving that car, yeah.
Everyone's got that car on the road all of a sudden, right? So you just become hyper aware of it. So if you give yourself an assignment, you're going to start thinking, okay, I got to look for doors. I mean, that's something that interests me. I'm developing a little bit of a portfolio of these doors as I travel over time. So doors is one thing that I do.
Interesting.
It could be whatever interests you. It might be displays at a market. It could be wildlife, things like that. Whatever it is that interests you, you're going to be good at shooting it, and you're going to find it more often than you think.
Well, the other thing that I liked in one of your other pictures was you took a very different point of view. You shot from looked like practically lying on your belly to shoot that. And I've sometimes thought as an assignment, okay, now instead of shooting from, for me, I'm a 6'3" person, so all of my shots are shot about the same height. What if I get low? What am I missing from different angles or something like that? What if I look up more often or down more often? And so for me, it isn't even always necessarily the subject, but you're right. Just giving myself some different way to think is interesting. And sometimes doesn't work at all, but sometimes results in something special.
Right. And I call that getting around your subject. So shooting it from all different angles, and certainly non-traditional ones.
Okay.
And so you're making a great effort to do that. So you're going to find the unique angles, the unique shots. Everyone's taking a picture of whatever that statue is, sort of from regular person height. But what if you shot straight up from its leg or from above and down at it? Those are the unique images that you can create.
Well, and for me, the one that I think of that way was in the Louvre, standing in front of the Mona Lisa. Everyone is crowding in trying to get a picture of this incredibly small picture. It's surprising when you see it in real life. And my favorite shot was the one I got so far off to the side that I could get the reflection of the photographers in the glass for the painting. And I found that much more interesting than any picture I had of the picture itself.
Absolutely, because you've got 50 photographers that are getting the picture of the picture, but you're capturing the photographers shooting it, which is much more unique. Absolutely, I love it.
Well, and that leads a little bit into one of your other tips I know that you sent me, which was to notice reflections.
Yeah, I'm big on reflections. I love to look in windows, anything that's chrome. hubcaps.
Interesting.
Yeah, you name it. I'm looking for a reflection that's going to give me something unique. And I'm always looking in water. The image that I have here is of a man reflected in the reflecting pond at the Crown Fountain in Millennium Park in Chicago.
Oh, sure. Okay. Interesting.
And it's a little reflecting pond that's probably just a 1/4 inch of water deep. But this gentleman was standing there, and behind him was this really big video display, 50 feet tall.
Right.
But I went down into the water, and so you just see his legs, but then his full body reflected upside down in the water.
And I really loved this one. This was one of my favorite photos that you sent me just because it's a very different shot, and it's now a piece of art.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's a very different picture. I have a picture of standing in that same place, but my picture is up about 30 degrees looking at the people who are standing there with the screen in the background and missing the reflections. So
Yeah, and this one too, what I'll say is always watch your horizons. Now, that could be a standard sort of natural horizon, like the horizon of a landscape. Or it could even be a man-made horizon, like in this image, where the bricks that make up the video display up top, if I was even a little bit off with my horizon, it would be very obvious.
Right.
And that's the mark of an amateur, is to have horizons that are off. So always watch your horizons.
or at least off a little bit, not intentionally off, you're saying.
That's right. You know, if you're trying to do something artistic by throwing it off, fantastic.
Well, and one of the things I enjoy about some of the newer post-production software is they let me correct the one where I have the ships apparently drifting off the horizon because the water is at a 10-degree angle or something like that. Obviously, if I can get that straight in the camera, then I'll save myself some work later on.
You said it.
Excellent. And you were talking about reflections, and I've done the reflections in the windows. I've caught the picture I can think of on Crete of the Greek church in the window, but hubcaps caught me a little bit by surprise. I'm curious if you could send me a picture of what you got of some of those more unusual reflections, because I'd have to say I'm not as attuned to looking for it that I'm looking for it in hubcaps.
Okay, I'll send you some. You know, when I take my students out and they see me sort of creaking my neck around a corner or something, I'm sure they're wondering what I'm up to, but then they walk over and I point out, we look at it this way, the church is going to be reflected in the window here.
Right.
Or one of the wonderful shots that I love that I didn't take, I wish I would have, was a picture of, I believe it was the two World Trade Towers reflected in a New York taxi cab window.
Interesting.
So you've got these two very iconic things of New York and one reflected in the other. I just love those kind of shots. I'm always looking for that. And I'll send you some.
Interesting. Yeah, excellent. Okay, what else should we think of?
You know, diagonals are a design element that are very pleasing to the eye for some reason. And so I sent you an image that I took actually from a commercial airliner flying above Miami. Now, I always have my camera with me when I'm flying. I always try to sit by a window, not near the wing. And I'm always at the ready, especially when we're coming into a place, because obviously the airplane was banking for me to be able to shoot straight down like this.
Right.
But you have to be aware of your polarizer too. You don't want to shoot with a polarizing filter on your camera because the airplane windows are polarized and you'll get that rainbow effect.
Okay.
And you don't want the camera up against the window because it could introduce vibration. And you certainly don't want to use a flash.
Oh, sure.
But in this image, I like this diagonal I created with the seashore there. And what makes this image for me is that little boat in the bottom right-hand corner that, again, gives that little human touch in an otherwise sort of blank area.
Interesting.
Gives some balance to it. So I'm always looking for diagonals as well.
And you mentioned the flash, and watching other people with their camera and how they use the flash has probably provided me with more amusement than anything else. I just think of the people whose flashes are going off at the Super Bowl, unaware that it really only works for 10 to 20 feet. Are there other things like that you see people, and I'm going to use wrong as if there is a right and wrong in photography, do in a way that you think is not as good more often?
Well, I'll tell you, what I like to say is that I use a flash in the daytime and I don't at night.
Interesting, okay.
I use it in the daytime
For fill
mostly
flash?
for fill flash,
Okay.
exactly. So I want to fill in the shadows, especially from that harsh noonday sun. So I want to fill in the shadows from people's eyes, under their nose, under their chin. And I also want to not use it at night because it usually gets this harsh light.
Sure.
And so I do whatever I can to either I'll take a lot of handheld shots, even in very low light situations. I'm certainly bumping up my ISO as needed, but I may be leaning against a building or a tree for extra stability. I'll definitely have my vibration reduction. I'm a Nikon user, or image stabilization for Canon users, but using a tripod is ideal, or a beanbag as well.
Sure, and the timer or something, or a remote.
Self-timer or remote, absolutely.
Now, for somebody obviously who's doesn't have a digital SLR, who's shooting more with a point and shoot, there's only so much we can do at night, at least with hands on the camera. Hands off, we're going to be able to get a few more shots than we can because just of things moving. Any tricks for the up-and-coming shutterbug who doesn't have the equipment necessarily to do the same shot you could get at night? You talked about stabilizing the camera. Obviously, that's a great way to do things. Any other things that you've learned?
Well, I take a lot of shots. I always carry a point and shoot with me.
Okay.
I always say that the best camera is the one that you'll actually use.
Yeah.
So if you're intimidated by higher end SLRs with interchangeable lenses and stuff, no problem shooting with a point and shoot camera. My classes are all about the fact that it's not about the camera. So they're more about developing your photographic eye and noticing and seeing and taking advantage of more and better photo opportunities. But with those point and shoots, you can bump up the ISO, which is a sensitivity of the sensor to light. So the higher the number, the more sensitive it is going to be to light. However, the trade-off is digital noise or grain.
Sure.
But I would rather have a grainy shot of something than a clear shot of nothing because I didn't take the picture.
And you can always throw it away if you didn't like it. So
Absolutely, that's right.
Okay.
But always leaning up against something, using that VR, that stabilization function on your camera. I try the shot. Even if it comes out blurry, I learned what didn't work. But I will try to get the shot, even in low light.
Okay. What's the next tip?
I say experiment with depth of field. Now, the images that I provided you here are two that I took at Dachau. And that, of course, is the concentration camp just outside of Munich. And so what I did with this is there's a menorah in the background and then some barbed wire in the foreground. So what I'll do is I'll focus on the barbed wire, and then using a shallow depth of field, that background, which is the menorah, will be out of focus. Then I will focus on the menorah in the background and blow out or blur the barbed wire in the foreground.
And when we say depth of field, we should pause here for those who don't know. We're really just saying that based on how small the opening is in the camera, more or less of your shot, depending on how far it is away from you, will be in focus.
That's right.
There has to be a better way to explain it than that, but yeah.
Yeah, it has to do with the aperture. And so if you've got a small opening, you're going to have more of the image from front to back that will be in focus. And a larger opening is going to give you a more shallow depth of field. So less of the image from front to back is going to be in focus. And there's different times to use those for different types of photography. But when I use it, as I mentioned, I'm really doubling the amount of photo opportunities that I can get.
Right.
Because I could have just taken one shot of that scene, but this way I got two pretty different shots. And side by side, they're pretty impressive. Whatever the scene is that you shoot like that, I do that all the time. I really try to do that.
Well, then I want to refer back to that picture that we talked about earlier where we mentioned depth of field, which was the woman in the yellow hat. So as I look at that shot, I think that if you had shot that with a smaller opening and got more depth of field, and the city there in the background, which I think is Prague,
yes,
would also be clear, and I think this picture wouldn't be as good. I liked your choice here in terms of how you used the depth of field.
Right, because the subject now is more of the focus than the background, so we'd kind of lose that subject in a more focused background because it would be kind of busier. So this way we sort of blur it out, and the subject becomes much more of the focus of the image.
And we often, for that reason, obviously see short depth of field used in portrait work, for one thing.
That's correct. That's exactly when you would want to use it. You want that subject to be the focus and the background not to take away from the subject.
Okay. And what else should we think about?
I like to talk about capturing the essence of a place. That's actually the name of one of my classes. But what that has to do is it helps you to create a cultural portrait of a place. There's nothing worse than sitting through someone's slideshow of images of even the most beautiful landscapes in the world. But after about the 10th or 15th one, you're kind of like, enough's enough. So the idea with capturing the essence of a place is to come up with a shot list. And there's about 50 50 different categories that I've come up with on a shot list. And they vary from everything from architecture to fashion and style, food and beverage, people, landscapes. So these are different categories of a shot list, so that if you make an effort to shoot some images within each of those categories, I guarantee you'll come back with a really well-rounded portfolio of images to show your friends and family.
So if I'm just shooting doors, you're saying I'm missing something here.
I think so.
Well, that might
That's a
explain
great
a lot, but
category.
okay, all right.
That's a great, one of those categories,
Right.
but the idea is to come back with a well-rounded portfolio so that you keep your viewers' interests.
Okay, excellent.
Unless you're creating a book just on the doors of Dublin or something.
Well, don't put it past me, but I'd have to get to Dublin first. But
I've never been myself.
okay. We've got a couple more tips here as we start to wind this down. What are your last few tips?
Well, I like to talk about seek the unique.
Okay.
And with that, I am showing these two different views of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, up in your neck of the woods.
Well, yeah, I enjoyed this one. Mm-hmm.
So the first image is kind of a standard view. You're walking there.
You're standing at Fort Point.
4 Point, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
You've got this beautiful, very interesting, thick chain in the foreground. I purposely placed it right on that transition between the boardwalk and the water. Mm-hmm. And then I've got the Golden Gate Bridge in the background, of course. Mm-hmm. This is kind of like a vertical horizon. So I've got the Golden Gate Bridge tower there, and I want to make sure that it's parallel with the left side of the frame.
Okay.
Now, with the second shot, what I did is I actually got down on my rear end and shot up through the chain with just kind of a hint of the bridge in the background, so that you know it's the Golden Gate Bridge, but it's a little bit different and more unique of an angle than sort of the standard shot. Mm-hmm. So again, that goes back to your point about sort of getting around your subject, my point about manipulating the scene.
Right.
Making the scene do what you want it to do. Again, it goes back to depth of field. So I'm focused on this very detailed chain in the foreground, but I'm using a large opening, small number, shallow depth of field, so that bridge in the background is out of focus, but you still can tell what it is.
Okay.
And then I like to go back to telling a story. So I mentioned that brandy snifter in Kotor, Montenegro, but the image that I show here is of Tram 22 in Prague. Mm-hmm. And in the background, you can see St. Vitus Cathedral. And there's just a story behind this. I took our group onto the tram. They trusted me. Got onto the tram. I asked the driver in my broken English if the tram was going up to the Castle Hill. And he pretty much just kind of said, yeah, and pointed to the back. So I assumed that meant, yes, it's going up to the Castle Hill. And we jumped on, 6 of us, and sure enough, we ended up on the other side of the river.
Yeah, I think you wanted Tram 20, as I recall, but...
Well, Tram 22 goes up there, but we took it the wrong direction.
To the wrong direction. Okay.
So, just a little silly story behind this image, but I still like the shot. Mm-hmm. But that's what I call a storytelling shot. So let your pictures tell a story. So they don't have to be the wonderful landscapes and the beautiful people, but if there's a story behind the image, generally your viewers will be interested in that as well.
Excellent. So as we go to wind this up, and those are the tips that you had sent me here, I just wanted you to think, what was the picture you took that you knew that now you were a photographer? You started, like the rest of us, being someone who took pictures and ended up a photographer. Was there some point at which you saw something that you had done and said, that's different?
That's a great question. And there really was 2 points that I could think of. I was living in Chicago, and I have this one shot that I took of the Bean, mm-hmm. or Cloud Gate, and I caught this gentleman walking his bike right next to it. And I'm just showing a very small portion of the Bean, this reflection of the city in the Bean, but then these very straight lines of the building across the way that are not reflected, and then this person walking a bike providing that sense of scale. And I've gone back there probably 4 or 5 times to try to recreate anything like that shot again, and I never could. I got a lot of sort of accolades from people that saw that shot that really enjoyed it. It was one of my first digital cameras. That was something that really got me going.
Interesting.
And like I said, it's just one of those lucky shots that you have trouble going back and trying to recreate.
And you say there were 2 time points.
And the second one was actually a series of shots that I took underneath a bridge in Chicago. It's on the Chicago River, and I believe it's the Columbus Drive Bridge. And you can walk under it. There's a couple walkways. And during the time of day that I was there, the sunshine was coming through the grates of the bridge above. And it just created these wonderful patterns and light. And so I must have taken 40 or 50 shots of the underside of this bridge. And it made me think how you can take something so mundane as the underside of a bridge and make a series of really neat images out of it. So that got me really excited about photography.
Excellent. Well, this is already turning into one of the longest shows, and it is because this is a topic that I love. So people have to put up apparently with what I love. But Ralph, we probably should wrap this up. Our guest has been Ralph Velasco, and you can find Ralph at many places on the web, and I'll put a link to some of his websites, but we mentioned one which is photowalkingtours.com. You can also find him at ralphvelasco.com. And then, Ralph, you also have a book on this topic that is just coming out, or what's the date for that?
Actually just came out in early December before the holidays.
And the name of the book?
And it's called Ralph Velasco on Travel Photography, 101 Tips for Developing Your Photographic Eye and More.
So this is really just a taste. We could have had this show be 10 times longer, so people really shouldn't feel mad at me for how long the show got, is what we're saying.
Absolutely. We could have gone on for hours on that topic. People can find the book at ontravelphotography.com.
Okay. Ralph, thanks so much for coming on the show and talking to us a little bit about travel photography.
Oh, my pleasure, Chris. As you know, I love this subject as well.
In the resource section, I want to point out one resource that most of you don't take advantage of, and that is the Amateur Traveler site itself, especially the blog. I don't know if you've realized that I've started to blog about more travel gadgets. I'll be doing more of that this year, and so, for instance, you can find reviews of both the new Google phone, the Google Nexus 1, which is an interesting phone, and an interesting phone for travelers since it has the built-in turn-by-turn and GPS information. And then the other thing I blogged about just in this last week is something I saw at CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, and that is a handheld underwater video camera by Kodak, which comes in under $150 and is targeted at consumers. So check out both of those blog posts at blog.amateurtraveler.com. In news from the community, Nomadic Matt, who has been on the show recently talking about the old capitals of Thailand, is having a contest to win a trip to Costa Rica. And so he would like you to check out his site for details about that contest. I got an email this week from Tori, who is traveling to Transylvania, having been inspired by that particular episode of The Amateur Traveler. And then I got a direct message from Tess on Twitter, who just got back from London and stayed in one of the flats from the vendor I recommended and had a terrific time. So that's always great to hear when people are taking the advice and enjoying it. And then I got a little more challenging email from Rick, who says, a friend of mine is traveling to Puerto Vallarta next month and wanted to share your podcast with her, episode 156. However, her PC is ultra slow and her internet connection is dial-up, believe it or not. So I burned a CD with this episode. I played the CD in my DVD player connected to my TV. The audio is perfect, but there are no pictures, which makes the program so much more interesting. Any ideas how to create a CD/DVD with audio and pictures? And I wrote back to Rick, I know how to do that from a Mac, which would be you would turn the AAC version, the iTunes Enhanced version, into a QuickTime movie, and you can do that with QuickTime itself, and then you can load that movie up into iDVD, and there you go. I don't know how to do that on PC. And speaking of the enhanced version with the pictures, I do want to remind people of something that I told you 2 months ago, which is that pretty soon you won't be able to find the older episodes of the enhanced version on iTunes. So you probably want to subscribe to it to get all the latest versions. I'll still have them on the website at least for a while, and then I am going to create a premium site and put some of the older episodes of the enhanced version behind the premium site probably in about a month. I'm targeting roughly February for that, so I want to give you again some warning for that. I do want to remind those of you who have an iPhone to check out the Amateur Traveler application. Also remind you that this podcast is part of the Travelcast Network at travelcastnetwork.com. And check out the other shows at that network. With that, We're finally going to bring this show to a close. If you have any questions, feel free to comment on this show or drop me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. Follow me on Twitter or Facebook. You'll find those links on the Amateur Traveler page. I had mentioned something about the Mac earlier, so as long as we're pimping the Mac, I'm going to end the show after the closing theme song with a promo for a good friend of mine, Victor Kayao, who runs the Typical Mac User podcast. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
Got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
There's nothing like an apple. But do you really appreciate everything that is an apple? Sure, there's the attractive outer skin, but then you get to the meat of your apple, right down to the very core. There's a lot in there. Discover all the goodness your sweet apple can provide you, along with the occasional rotten spots, worms, and bugs. With the Typical Mac User podcast and website, go to typicalmacuser.com. Go on, take a bite. It's quite tasty.